First tonight, there's been another sharp rise in rough sleeping in Nottingham. The city's outreach team identified well over 700 people who spent at least one night on the streets in the last year. And one businessman has even moved into his car after getting evicted from his home. Our social affairs correspondent Jeremy Ball has more.
Turning a hatchback into a home. Tassos used to be well paid, an IT consultant, but he was evicted after a legal dispute.
Keeping things organised in a tight space is quite important.
There are challenges he didn't expect. The car kept unlocking itself when his perspiration got into the boot sensor. And now dinner's just a ready meal that only needs hot water.
It can almost be an assault on your identity. I was on £450 a day as contractor. I was even in the shelter with somebody who used to be a millionaire. And there's so many, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anybody. And it can be one of the most soul-destroying things.
Others are bedding down in the city centre, where street outreach workers offer everyone support with their physical and mental health, and to find a hostel place or supported accommodation. But 26-year-old Ryan is back out on the streets.
So if you sleep in the city centre, you're mostly going to get kicked or really hurt. In the past, I used to get housed like that, but I stayed there temporary. I've been in supported accommodations. It hasn't worked out and stuff. Not enough support. I need better support 24/7 and people who understands me.
And Ryan's not alone. 746 individuals were found sleeping rough in Nottingham for at least one night in the last financial year. That's up from 556 the year before, a rise of 34%. Part of that rise is the ending of a policy called Everyone In, when rough sleepers were offered hotel rooms that were empty during the pandemic. But homelessness charities say there are new factors too.
We're still seeing a number of people sleeping rough who have done so for many years, who have very complex needs. But superimposed on that, we have a new cohort of rough sleepers who've lost their homes primarily due to economic reasons, and those economic problems are getting worse, and we're seeing the problem getting worse.
Most people who lose their homes can get some form of temporary accommodation, and the government set out a strategy to end rough sleeping for good. But for now, homelessness charities are facing increasing demand. Tassos says he spent time in a field exposed to the elements.
If you're sleeping rough outside and it's raining, it's horrible. And people do turn to drugs and alcohol. I've seen it. I've known people who have died, one person at the shelter. And it was easily avoidable and totally unnecessary. If I wanted to watch a film...
For now, Tassos is trying to make his car as homely as he can.
My head would be there and I would just lie down and watch a film.
But is this really living, or is it merely existing?
Well, Jeremy's here in the studio with us. I mean, you can tell in that report that the reasons people rough sleep are quite complicated, aren't they? But how typical is this rising number in Nottingham?
It is difficult to make comparisons, Sarah, because Nottingham is one of the few places where the outreach teams go out every single night. But you will find people out there for a night or two for all sorts of reasons. People get evicted, relationships break down, people get released from prison. Then you'll find people who can't stay in hostels. Often that's to do with drug and alcohol problems. And there are others who simply aren't entitled to emergency accommodation here. Some of those are foreign nationals. Others are people who've moved to Nottingham and they get told to apply to their local council for help instead.
So what's being done to tackle it?
Well, the big thing from the government is a strategy to eradicate rough sleeping. Now, a huge amount of money going into that, something called Housing First, which is aimed at vulnerable people like Ryan in that report, who's looking forward to getting somewhere this September. And the idea there is there's a lot of support to hold down a tenancy. There's a real focus on working much more closely with the NHS, with job centres, for instance. And the idea is you get somewhere to live before you have to sort your life out.
And I mean, that sounds so straightforward. Maybe an obvious question, maybe not. But why hasn't that been done before?
It's very expensive, first of all, and that's because people need so much support. But what Andrew Redfern from Framework says is, look, we know this sort of thing can work because well over a decade ago, they had a scheme called supported housing, which offered a lot of help with drug and alcohol addiction. And he says that was very successful in getting the numbers down. And we also saw how successfully those hotels got homeless people off the streets during the pandemic. That was very successful. And that worked partly because people from out of town qualified too. All of this, though, very, very costly.